Celeste Grant was 38 years old when the process server found her in the receiving line at her father's funeral, and she took the envelope from his hand the way she took most difficult things, which was quietly, and without giving the moment more of herself than it had already taken. She had been standing in the foyer of Greater Emmanuel Church in Nashville, Tennessee, in a black dress she had owned for years and low heels she had chosen for the hours of standing ahead, greeting people who had known her father for decades, people who came from his professional world and from his church and from the neighborhood where she had grown up. Her husband Theo was 4 feet to her left, and he was watching the process server leave the building with the composed stillness of a man who had planned for this outcome and was relieved to have it behind him. She had known this was coming. She had not known it would be today, at this hour, in this room. She placed the envelope in her purse. She turned back to the receiving line. She shook the next hand and said thank you for coming and meant it, and said her father had always spoken well of this person and meant that too, because her father, Lionel Grant, had been a civil engineer for 41 years and a man of specific and considered words, and she had learned from watching him that the quality of a person's attention in ordinary moments was the truest measure of them. What Theo had not considered, in the months of planning that had preceded this day, was what Lionel Grant had built quietly across 41 years. The patents, the consultancy, the royalty income from water infrastructure components licensed to municipalities in 9 states, or what he had arranged, in the year before his diagnosis deepened, to pass cleanly and completely to his daughter. What Theo did not know was that the envelope he had arranged to have delivered at his father-in-law's funeral contained divorce papers served against a woman who had just become, as of that morning, one of the more quietly significant engineering heirs in the Mid-South. He had timed the papers for her most vulnerable moment. He had no idea he had also timed them for the morning after the most consequential document in her life had transferred into her name. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The house on Kirkwood Drive in Nashville had been her parents' house before it was hers, and when her mother passed 8 years ago and her father decided the maintenance of the full house was more than he wanted to manage alone, he had offered it to Celeste at a price that reflected what it had cost him to build rather than what the market said it was worth, which was his way of giving her something without calling it a gift. She had renovated it carefully over 4 years, room by room, with the systematic patience of a woman who had been trained to think about structures, how they were loaded, where the stress points were, what held and what didn't under conditions that exceeded the design assumptions. The hallway was the room she was most particular about. She had refinished the floors herself, a warm chestnut stain she had mixed twice to find the right depth, and she had hung the artwork along both walls with the deliberateness of a woman choosing what she wanted to walk past every day. On the left wall, midway down the hall, was a framed drawing, not a photograph, but a technical pen and ink rendering, the kind done by hand before computer drafting became standard, showing the cross-section of a valve assembly for a water distribution system. Her father had drawn it in 1987, the year the patent was filed. She had framed it the winter after her mother passed, because she wanted it visible, because she found that looking at it in the ordinary passage of a day reminded her of what precision looked like when it came from a person who understood the thing they were designing. Theo had called it her dad's work stuff. He had said it with the mild, benign inattention of a man who had decided that the drawing was decorative and had never asked what it was a drawing of. Her father, Lionel Grant, had spent his career as a principal engineer at a civil engineering consultancy in Nashville that he had co-founded in 1986 and had grown, across 4 decades, into a regional firm with projects across the Southeast. Alongside the firm work, He had filed 11 patents over his career, most of them related to municipal water infrastructure components, valves, flow regulators, coupling systems, designed to solve specific problems he had encountered in the field, and licensed to water authorities and municipalities in 9 states. The royalty income had been modest in the early years and had compounded as adoption spread and the patents renewed. In his last active year before the diagnosis, the combined royalty income had exceeded $380,000. He had told Celeste about the patents when she was in graduate school, not as a disclosure, but as a lesson. He had said that the value of intellectual work was not in the moment of the idea, but in the structure you built around it, and that a patent was simply the paperwork that proved a thought had been worked into something real. She had listened with the attention she always gave him and had gone back to her graduate coursework and had filed the information in the part of her mind she kept for things that would matter later. She had met Theo at a professional development event in Nashville 7 years ago. He was a project manager for a construction development firm and was easy to be with in rooms, the kind of man who found the right register for every conversation and never strained against it. She had liked that. She had told him she was a civil engineer, and he had nodded and moved the conversation to other things, which she had taken at the time as the natural rhythm of a beginning. Across 7 years of marriage, his understanding of her professional life had not deepened. He knew she worked in infrastructure. He had attended 2 company events and been charming, and he had never asked with any precision about the patents or about the consultancy her father had built and that bore, in its registered name, the initials of the family she had been born into. He had known Lonel was ill. He had been attentive in the early months. In the way of a man managing an inconvenience he wanted to be seen managing well, and less attentive as the illness extended and became more grinding, which was the way it went with people who were performing support rather than offering it. The sign had arrived 4 months before the funeral. It was small, a hotel charge on the credit card bill, a property she recognized as a boutique hotel in the Gulch neighborhood of Nashville on a Thursday evening when Theo had told her he was at a work dinner in Brentwood. She had noted it and had not said anything because her father's condition had worsened that week, and she did not have the bandwidth for 2 things at once, and had told herself she would return to it. She had returned to it the afternoon of the funeral. She had been in the church for 4 hours by the time the last guest moved through the receiving line and the fellowship hall cleared and the family was left in the quiet of the building with the flowers and the folding chairs and the weight of the day. Theo had gone to bring the car around. She sat in the second pew with her purse in her lap and her father's program in her hand, and she opened the envelope. She read the papers. Her face remained perfectly calm. She placed the papers back in the envelope and placed the envelope in her purse and sat for another moment with her father's program, looking at his photograph on the cover, the one they had chosen from a trip he had taken to the coast 2 years before the diagnosis, standing with his hand on the railing of a dock with the water behind him, squinting slightly into the afternoon sun with the expression he always had when he was thinking about something specific. She thought about what he had told her in the last clear conversation she had with him, 6 weeks before he passed. He had been sitting in his chair in the living room at Kirkwood Drive with a window light on him and a folder in his lap, and he had said, "I have arranged everything correctly. The work that matters has been arranged to stay with the person who understands it." He had looked at her directly when he said it, and she had understood that the word person was not general. She picked up her phone. She looked at Theo's phone lying on the pew beside her, where he had set it when he went to handle something at the front of the church 2 hours earlier and had left it, not fully locked, in the way of a man who had not calculated that this particular surface would matter. She did not look at the phone. She looked at the screen. She did not touch it. The notification was visible in the preview without unlocking. The name was Priya. The message said, "Is today done? Can I see you tonight?" She registered it the way she registered a stress calculation that confirmed what the preliminary model had suggested without surprise, with the particular steadiness of a person who had suspected a result and was now in possession of the measurement. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She stood. She placed her father's program in her bag beside the envelope. She walked to the car. She did not say anything to Theo that evening, because she was a woman who had spent her career understanding that the integrity of a structure depended on not introducing force at a point before the analysis was complete, and her analysis was not yet complete. She had documents to review first. The will reading was the following Wednesday. Her father's attorney, a man named Henry Osai, who had been handling Lionel Grant's estate documents for 22 years, conducted the reading in his offices on Charlotte Avenue with Celeste and her father's younger sister, Aunt Rochelle, and a representative of the civil engineering consultancy present. Theo had asked to attend, and Henry had told him, politely, that the reading was restricted to named beneficiaries and legal representatives, which was correct, and which Theo had accepted with a composure that did not fully conceal his interest. What the will conveyed to Celeste was this: the family home on Kirkwood Drive, which she already occupied, a 62% controlling interest in Grant Engineering Consultants, LLC, the full portfolio of 11 patents and their associated licensing agreements, and a sealed letter separate from the will itself, to be opened by Celeste alone, addressed in her father's handwriting and marked in the lower left corner with the words, "When you are ready." Henry Osai completed the reading and looked at her over his reading glasses. "Your father was precise," he said. "Everything here is correctly structured. The patents are assigned to you individually. The consultancy interest transfers on the date of death. The royalty income will continue under the existing licensing agreements and is now yours to administer." Celeste sat with that for a moment. What is the current estimated value of the patent portfolio and the consultancy interest together? Henry opened a second folder. He placed a valuation summary on the table. The number on the bottom line was 4. $2 million in assessed value, with annual royalty income projected forward at the current rate. Aunt Rochelle, who was 70 years old and had been at Lionel's side through 40 years of his professional life, looked at the number and then looked at Celeste and said, in the particular, quiet way of a woman who had been waiting for the right moment, "He built it for you. He always said he was building it for you." Celeste drove home from Henry Osai's office and went to the hallway and stood in front of her father's patent drawing for a long time. The cross-section of the valve assembly. The clean, precise lines of a man who had understood that a thing designed correctly could operate without supervision, could serve its function in a system without requiring anyone to watch it, could pay out its value across years without being seen by anyone except the municipalities that depended on it, and the engineer who had understood the problem clearly enough to solve it. She opened the sealed letter that evening, alone at the kitchen table, with a glass of water and the house quiet around her. Her father had written 3 pages in the careful, readable hand of a man who had drawn precise lines his entire career. He had written about the patents and why he had structured them the way he had. He had written about the consultancy and what he wanted her to do with it, and what he trusted her to know about doing it. And at the end, in a paragraph she read twice, he had written that he had watched her marriage across 7 years with the attention of a father who loved his daughter and who had kept his own counsel, and that he had arranged things the way he had arranged them so that whatever came next, she would be standing on something solid. He had written, "You were always the engineer in that house. Trust the structure. She folded the letter and placed it in the folder with the will documents and picked up her phone and called Tanya Birch. Tanya Birch had practiced family law in Nashville for 18 years and had a reputation among attorneys who appeared against her for a careful, systematic approach to financial disclosure that made concealment a particularly poor strategy. She had been Celeste's personal attorney for 4 years, handling estate matters, and she received the summary of the week's events, the divorce papers, the hotel charge, the phone notification, the will reading, without expression, and said she could meet Friday. They met at Tanya's office on Friday morning. Celeste brought the divorce papers, the hotel charge annotated with the date, and the patent portfolio summary and consultancy valuation from Henry Osai. She laid them on the table in order. Tanya reviewed the filing first. Theo's filing claimed an equitable share of all marital assets, including any business interests or intellectual property acquired during the marriage, a clause inserted with the specific language of someone who had been advised to include it. He believed you might be inheriting something, she said. He knew my father had a consultancy. He did not know about the patents. He knew there was a framed drawing in the hallway that I called my father's work. He never asked what it was a drawing of. The patents were filed before your marriage, all 11, the most recent in 2009. We married in 2016. Then the portfolio is your separate property. Premarital intellectual property does not become marital at the date of inheritance. She made a note. The consultancy bequest we will need to review, but if your father held it separately and transferred it by will, that argument fails too. My father was a precise man, Celeste said. He arranged everything correctly. The hotel charge. Is that the only documented evidence? I also observed a notification on his unlocked phone. The contact was listed as Priya. The message asked if today was done. Tanya wrote the name and moved to the next section. 2 days later, Celeste drove to the home of Aunt Rochelle, who lived in a craftsman house in East Nashville, and who had, in the days since the will reading, been in the state of a woman holding something back and ready to let it out. I knew about the woman, Rochelle said, without preamble as soon as they sat down. I saw them together in February at a restaurant on 5th. I recognized him. I didn't tell you because your father was getting worse and I didn't know how to add it. She looked directly at Celeste. I am sorry. You don't need to apologize, Celeste said. What did you see? Rochelle described it, the restaurant, the table by the window, a woman with dark hair in a light-colored jacket, the ease of Theo's posture in a way she had never seen when he sat across from his wife. Your father's letter, Rochelle said. Did he say anything? He said he had been watching, Celeste said, and that he had arranged things so whatever came next, I would be standing on something solid. Rochelle was quiet. He knew. He always knew. That's why he arranged it the way he did. Celeste drove home and thought about the framed drawing in the hallway and about the calculation her father had made across the last year of his life, and about the way an engineer designs for load conditions that exceed what the ordinary user anticipates. Because the structure has to hold even when it is asked to bear more than anyone planned for. Her father had designed for this. The week that followed, Celeste continued the ordinary routines of a woman who had buried her father and received divorce papers and was, by anyone's visible measure, simply keeping moving. She went to the office. She made 2 calls to the consultancy's managing partner, who received her with the straightforward warmth of someone ready to welcome her into the role her father had been pointing toward for years. She came home and cooked simple meals and said necessary things to Theo when they were required. Theo was performing consideration. He asked how she was doing in the voice of a man managing a gap between the divorce he had filed and the grief he was expected to honor, and the management showed. She watched and said little. Preparation is the work. The settlement conference was scheduled 3 weeks after the funeral at Tanya Birch's offices on Charlotte Avenue with Theo's attorney, a family law specialist named Gordon, who had a reputation for aggressive asset argumentation, on the other side of the table. Theo arrived with Gordon and with the posture of a man who had been told by his attorney that the marital estate likely included a significant inheritance and that the filing's language had been inserted specifically to capture it. Tanya opened the meeting. She placed the patent portfolio summary on the table and introduced it as Exhibit A, 11 patents filed between 1987 and 2009, all predating the marriage by a minimum of 7 years, all assigned to Lionel Grant individually and now transferred by bequest to Celeste Grant, constituting separate property under Tennessee law. She placed the consultancy valuation beside it, with the transfer documents showing the bequest structure Henry Osai had established, a structure her father had arranged, Tanya noted, with the specific intent of ensuring clean separation from any marital claim. She placed the hotel charge record on the table. She placed Aunt Rochelle's signed statement describing the February restaurant observation beside it. Gordon leaned across to Theo and spoke in a low voice. Theo looked at the documents. He looked at the patent drawing in the exhibit folder, a printed copy of the original, the same cross-section of the valve assembly that had been hanging in the hallway on Kirkwood Drive for 4 years, and something in his expression shifted in the particular way of a man who has just understood that a thing he had looked at and dismissed was not what he had decided it was. He looked at Celeste. He said he had not realized the patents were that old. He said it in the voice of a man trying to locate a formulation that walked something back without appearing to walk it back, and it did not succeed as a formulation. Gordon placed his hand on Theo's arm and said something quiet. Then Gordon looked at Tanya and said they would need to consult before responding to the exhibit documentation. Tanya said they had time. She turned to the next section of the presentation, which addressed the marital asset division based on the actual marital estate, excluding the patents and the consultancy, and which was considerably less than Theo's filing had anticipated. Celeste sat at that table in her father's city, in the office of an attorney who had been a careful steward of her family's legal matters for years, and she looked at Theo across a document set that her father had spent the last year of his life arranging correctly, and she said what she had to say only once. "You planned to serve me those papers at the funeral," she said. "You chose that day because you believed I would be too overwhelmed to think clearly, and because you had decided it was the most efficient timing for what you wanted." She kept her voice at the same register it had been for 3 weeks, steady, unhurried. The voice of an engineer who had been trained by the best engineer she had ever known to evaluate a structure for what it actually was, rather than what it appeared to be. "My father spent 40 years building something you walked past in the hallway and called work stuff. You served me divorce papers on the morning after it transferred into my name." She paused once. "He designed for that too. He designed for everything." She stood. She gathered her folder. She walked out of the conference room and into the hallway and down to the lobby and out into the Nashville afternoon, and the city was loud and warm and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in that room. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about her father standing on the dock in the photograph on the funeral program, squinting into the sun and thinking about something specific. She knew what he had been thinking about. The structure had held. 13 months had passed by the time Celeste sat in the home office on Kirkwood Drive on a Sunday morning, with the chestnut floors warm in the early light, and the hallway drawing visible from where she sat, and a project file from Grant Engineering Consultants open in front of her. The settlement had finalized in March. The marital estate, stripped of the patents and the consultancy and the house, had been divided cleanly. Theo's filing had attempted to argue that the inheritance timing was marital adjacent, an argument that failed on every statutory ground it was tested against. He had left Nashville in April. She had heard through Rochelle that his development firm had restructured and left him in a reduced role, and that Priya Nair's studio had relocated to Atlanta in the summer. Whether they had left together was not information she pursued. She had taken on the managing partner role at Grant Engineering Consultants in May. The managing partner who had worked alongside her father for 20 years had said, in a conversation in June, that she had not expected to move her as much as it did, that Lionel Grant had talked about Celeste's eventual involvement in the firm for at least 10 years, and that her arrival felt like exactly what her father had been walking toward. There was a patent renewal in the queue, the valve assembly in the hallway drawing, and she had begun working through it herself with the patent attorney her father had used for 2 decades. And there was something in handling her father's original documentation and reading his precise notes that she found deeply sustaining. Beside her was a second cup of coffee, belonging to a man named Solomon, a water systems engineer she had met at a conference in February, who had introduced himself by asking about municipal valve failure rates in a way that revealed he had read her father's original patent filings. He had visited Kirkwood Drive once and walked the hallway and stopped in front of the framed drawing and said, without prompting, "That's the cross-section from the 1987 patent, isn't it?" Which told her everything she needed to know about the kind of attention he brought to the world. The Sunday light moved across the chestnut floor, and she looked at the drawing and at the project file and at the coffee cup, and she thought about the letter and the phrase that had stayed with her since the night she read it alone at the kitchen table. You were always the engineer in that house. Trust the structure. She had trusted it. It had held exactly the way he had designed it to hold. She was whole. She was sitting at her father's desk, doing her father's work, and the morning was long and quiet and entirely her own. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.